The truth is, I never thought I'd be the guy checking up on his wife, wondering what was going on behind the scenes. Mia and we were supposed to be past that phase where you worry about things like that. We had roots, a life built up over years, shared plans, shared dreams, the kind of life that felt solid and permanent. Maybe that's why it took me so long to see the cracks forming. At first, it was subtle. Mia seemed off. She started putting a lot more effort into her appearance than usual. I'd catch her checking her reflection in the mirror more often, fixing her hair even on days when we had no plans. She got into this habit of spending time on her makeup in the morning, blending and smoothing until it looked professional. When I asked about it, she'd laugh it off, saying she wanted to look put together. And maybe she did. But it was like she was dressing up for something, or someone, I couldn't quite figure out. Then there were the work dinners. She'd come home late, saying she'd been with colleagues, talking through strategies or catching up with clients. Mia's job in marketing had always been a busy one, but these dinners started happening more frequently. And there was something else that bugged me. I'd smell a faint scent of cologne mixed with her own perfume, something subtle but sharp, lingering when she'd brush past me. She'd wave off my questions with a light laugh, saying I was getting paranoid, or that the cologne was from someone at the office, like it was nothing. I'd shake it off, trying to believe her, trying to tell myself I was just imagining things. But it didn't stop there. Mia started taking private phone calls, slipping out of the room to answer her cell. She'd go into our bedroom, shut the door, and talk in hushed tones, coming back with this look on her face that I couldn't quite read. When I'd ask who it was, she'd shrug and say it was a coworker or her boss, someone she didn't want me to worry about. But her eyes would dart away, and I could feel the distance growing, like there was something she wasn't telling me. I told myself not to dig too deep. I wanted to trust her. 4 years, we'd had each other's backs, and I'd always believed in the strength of our marriage. But when the signs are right there, day after day, there's only so long you can keep looking the other way. I started noticing everything, the sudden gym membership, the new perfume she started wearing, and her texts, which she now angled away from me whenever she was on her phone. I'd see her typing fast, a small smile on her face, and then she'd glance over at me and quickly put the phone down. Something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling, no matter how hard I tried. One night, after another one of her work dinners, Mia came home later than usual. It was close to midnight, and I was pretending to be asleep when I heard her come in. She was quiet, trying not to wake me, but I couldn't miss the sound of her heels softly clicking on the hardwood, her gentle footsteps as she went straight to the bathroom. I listened as she moved around, and I couldn't help noticing how long she stayed in there. She ran the sink, the soft swish of water breaking the silence, and I could smell her perfume wafting out into the hallway, stronger than usual. It was almost like she was trying to wash off the night before coming to bed. When she finally slipped under the covers, I kept my breathing even, pretending to be asleep, even though my mind was racing. The next morning, I tried to bring it up gently. I asked her how her night was, if the client dinner went well, that sort of thing. Mia barely looked up from her coffee. She gave me a quick smile, saying, "Oh, you know, same old, just work stuff." She brushed it off like it was nothing, moving on to talk about some trip her boss was planning for their team. But something in her eyes didn't sit right with me. I could tell she wasn't telling me everything, and maybe it was the way she seemed almost too relaxed, too casual, like she'd rehearsed the line. A small, annoying voice in my head kept telling me not to drop it. So I pressed a little, asking about the people she'd been out with, if she was getting along with her team. She glanced at her watch, acting like she was already running late, and tossed out some names I didn't recognize. Then she reached for her phone, scrolling through her messages like she was eager to switch the topic, and that's when I noticed the name Theo pop up on her screen, just for a split second before she clicked out of it. She laughed at something he'd written, this quiet laugh she usually saved for moments when we were alone together, like he'd written something only she understood. I kept my face neutral, acted like I hadn't seen anything, but inside, I felt something twist. Theo. I'd heard of him before, in passing, her new colleague who joined the team last fall, someone she'd mentioned once or twice. I hadn't thought much about it then, but now, seeing the way her face softened when she looked at her phone, I knew I couldn't just brush this off. The day went on as usual, but in my head, it was anything but. I kept replaying that moment, wondering who Theo really was and why she'd never mentioned him in any real detail. That night, I made up my mind. I decided I needed to know what was going on, even if it hurt. I was tired of the quiet doubts eating away at me every night. So, when she went to bed, leaving her phone charging on the counter, I waited until I was sure she was asleep before quietly getting up, tiptoeing out of the bedroom. The house was silent, and I could hear the faint hum of her phone as I picked it up, hands shaking just a bit. I didn't want to find anything. Part of me was desperate to prove myself wrong. But as soon as I opened her messages and saw the latest conversation, I knew my gut had been right all along. There it was, right in front of me, a string of messages between Mia and Theo. It started off innocent enough, typical work talk, mentions of clients, deadlines, projects. But as I scrolled up, the tone changed. There were jokes, inside jokes I'd never heard before, little comments that felt way too personal. They'd clearly been talking for a while, and it was like I was seeing a side of her I didn't know anymore. Then I hit the message that made my stomach drop. It was a simple line, but it told me everything. Theo had written, "Can't stop thinking about last night. When can we have another work dinner?" Winky face. I could practically see the smirk behind that little winking emoji. And her response, just a blushing face and it soon with a heart. Felt like a punch straight to the gut. I'd been prepared to find something bad, but this was another level. Reading those words, it felt like I'd been slapped awake from a dream I didn't realize I'd been having. My hands went numb. I wanted to throw her phone across the room, to smash it to pieces, but I forced myself to stay quiet. The last thing I needed was her waking up and catching me. I scrolled through the rest of their messages, looking for any explanation that could make this hurt less. Maybe there'd be some clear sign it was just a joke, something harmless. But the more I read, the clearer it became. They had this whole world between them, one I hadn't been invited into. There were late-night messages, flirty exchanges, and talks of missing each other. And there it was, plain as day, her last message to him before she'd come home that night. "Can't wait to see you again." I put the phone back where I found it, taking a deep breath to steady myself. The reality of it all hit me in waves. Everything I'd built, everything we'd shared, it felt like it had been ripped apart. I walked back to the bedroom, feeling heavier with each step. Lying down beside her, I could barely look at her, even in the dark. This was Mia, the woman I'd loved for years, and now I didn't even recognize her. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling this cold, steady anger building inside me. Confronting her now, in the dead of night, felt pointless. It'd be nothing but a messy fight, one I'd probably lose because she'd have every excuse ready, every way to twist it around. Instead, I started thinking, really thinking for the first time in weeks. If she could lie to me, betray me like this, maybe it was time I did something she wouldn't see coming. And that's when the idea hit me. Lying there next to her, a plan started taking shape in my mind. I knew I couldn't confront her outright, not yet. No, she was expecting that, ready with whatever excuses or apologies she thought might keep her out of trouble. But I wanted something different. I wanted her to feel what it was like to be blindsided, to lose everything in a single moment. So I decided right then and there, I wouldn't just catch her. I'd make her regret every second of it. The next morning, I got up like usual. I made coffee, poured a mug for Mia just like I always did, and forced myself to act like nothing was wrong. I asked her about her plans for the day, casually slipping in a question about her next work dinner. She blinked a bit too hard, then forced a laugh. "Oh, nothing planned yet," she said, a little too breezy. I watched her closely, seeing her mask slip for just a second before she pulled it back on. I nodded, keeping my voice steady, and then I hit her with the next part. "Hey, I was thinking, we haven't gone on a real vacation in a while. Maybe it's time we got away, just the two of us." I kept my tone casual, like it was just a random thought. "How about somewhere we've never been? Something special, just for us?" Mia's face lit up, and for a second, I felt a flash of bitterness. She seemed genuinely excited, probably out of guilt, probably thinking she'd make it up to me with a trip. But all I could see was her betrayal, and that made it easier to keep my cool. She nodded eagerly. "That sounds amazing, Nolan. I'd love that." The rest of the day, I kept the act up. I went online, looked up luxury destinations, and started planning out every detail. A villa on the Mediterranean, private excursions, reservations at exclusive spots, everything perfectly designed to look like a trip meant for reconnecting. Mia was thrilled, going on about which outfits she'd bring and how she couldn't wait to spend this time together. I let her excitement grow, knowing it'd make the fall even harder. But behind the scenes, I was setting up something else entirely. I took out my laptop and logged into our joint accounts, scanning through every detail. Over the next few days, I moved everything, our savings, our investments, quietly over to accounts under my name only. She didn't know it yet, but I was preparing for a clean break. The house? I set up paperwork to get the mortgage transferred to my name alone. The credit cards? I started closing the ones in her name, cutting her off bit by bit without her even realizing. I moved some essentials over to a friend's place, boxing up clothes, files, anything I didn't want left behind. And every night, I'd lie next to her, pretending everything was fine, pretending I was the same husband I'd always been. But inside, I could feel something else taking over. A strange sense of calm, knowing I was one step ahead. By the time our departure day rolled around, everything was ready. I'd tied up every loose end, made every arrangement down to the last detail. When I suggested she head to the airport ahead of me to grab our seats early, she didn't even question it. She just smiled, kissed me goodbye, and left, not knowing what was waiting for her. As she walked out the door, I felt that strange calm settle in again. She'd go to the airport, wait for me, and slowly realize the truth as the notifications started coming in. The empty accounts, the blocked cards, the house that was no longer hers. It was all waiting for her, one painful message after another. And by then, I'd be long gone. Watching her walk out the door that morning felt like the final piece snapping into place. For once, I wasn't the one blindsided. I wasn't the one left wondering. She thought this trip was my way of saving our marriage, maybe a last attempt to reconnect or whatever she'd convinced herself it meant. She had no clue she was walking right into the ending I'd planned. After she left, I stood there for a moment, letting the silence fill the house. It was strange, the kind of silence that felt like a clean slate. No lies hanging in the air, no secrets. Just me, alone in what was now my house. I walked through each room, taking one last look at everything. Our photos on the walls, souvenirs from past vacations, the note she'd leave me on the kitchen counter back when I thought we were happy. It all felt distant now, like the remnants of someone else's life. A part of me almost felt sorry for her, for whatever version of her that might have once loved me. But that sympathy didn't last long. I'd already seen enough to know exactly who she'd become. I grabbed my bags, the ones I'd quietly packed in the days leading up to this, and threw them into the car. With one last look at the house, I locked the door, knowing that by the time she'd try to come back, her key wouldn't work anymore. Everything was arranged, down to the new locks I'd had installed just yesterday. Once I was on the road, I checked my phone, half expecting her to have already noticed something was wrong. But there were no messages, no calls. She'd probably just made it through security, maybe checked her phone one last time, feeling completely unaware of what was coming. I couldn't help but picture her sitting there at the gate, flipping through her phone, her heart probably racing with excitement over our reconnecting vacation. The irony almost made me laugh. I drove to the place I'd lined up, a small beach house a few hours away, simple but quiet, somewhere I could clear my head and start piecing together a new life without her. It wasn't luxury, but that didn't matter to me. What mattered was the space, the quiet, and the freedom. The feeling of finally letting go of the past. As I was unpacking, I got the first notification. A voicemail from a mutual friend. I'd told him just enough about what was going on, and he'd agreed to share the news with our friend group after I'd left. I knew he'd make sure everyone understood the truth. I wanted people to know that Mia was the one who destroyed everything, that I wasn't the bad guy for leaving her behind. It didn't take long for my phone to start lighting up. I imagined Mia sitting at the airport, refreshing her apps, trying to check her accounts, seeing her cards declined, scrambling as her world fell apart, piece by piece. I didn't check her messages. I didn't need to. I could imagine it all too well. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. I walked outside, stood by the water, and watched the sun sinking lower over the horizon, casting everything in shades of orange and gold. It felt like the start of something new. Something that was finally, fully mine. Back at the house, I poured myself a drink, just a quiet toast to closing that chapter. I was done. No more lies, no more pretending, No more looking over my shoulder or doubting my own instincts. Whatever came next, I'd face it on my own terms, without someone else's secrets hanging over me. I checked my phone once, out of habit, and saw a string of missed calls from Mia. I could picture her sitting at the airport, pacing around, calling and texting, wondering why her bank apps showed zero balances, why every call went straight to voicemail. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Her panicked messages, one after another, were enough. One of them read, "Nolan, where are you? I'm here at the airport. Please pick up. There's something wrong with my accounts. I can't access anything. Did you do something?" Her tone shifted from confused to desperate, and by the end, it almost sounded angry. As if I was the one at fault for cutting her off from the life she'd been so eager to betray. I ignored it, turning my phone off, setting it face down on the table. I'd made sure she'd feel exactly what I had felt all those months. Stranded, lost, without a single lifeline. The perfect little trap, and she'd walked right into it. After a while, my friend, who'd been in on the plan, called me up. "Hey man, you good?" he asked, sounding a little unsure. "She's been blowing up everyone's phone, saying she doesn't know where you are, that you abandoned her." I couldn't help but laugh. "Yeah, I'm more than good," I said, my voice steady. "She wanted to live a different life. One without me. I'm just making sure she gets it." He paused for a second, maybe letting it sink in. "People are already talking, you know. I think she's gonna realize real soon just how much she screwed up. Everyone's on your side. Just wanted you to know." That meant more to me than I'd expected. I knew I'd need the support of my friends in the months to come, and hearing they were behind me brought a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. I thanked him, told him to keep in touch, and then hung up, letting the silence fill the room again. That night, I slept better than I had in months, feeling like I'd finally reclaimed my life. The betrayal, the heartbreak, they were still there, somewhere in the background. But for the first time, they didn't feel heavy. They felt like memories I could look back on, knowing I'd done something about them, taken control in a way that would stay with me long after she was gone. As I drifted off, I thought of all the possibilities waiting ahead of me. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows, feeling like a different person. For the first time in a long time, there was no weight on my chest, no gnawing suspicion lingering in the back of my mind. I got up, brewed some coffee, and walked out onto the small deck overlooking the beach. The air was cool, the waves calm. It was a fresh start, and I could almost feel it settling into my bones. I took my time, savoring the quiet morning, flipping through a book I'd brought along but hadn't had the focus to read in ages. It felt strange to just be there, on my own, no tension, no doubts pulling at me. My phone was off, and I hadn't checked any messages, but I didn't feel the usual urge to reach for it. I knew that as soon as I turned it on, there'd be more messages from Mia, probably more calls from friends or family trying to understand what had happened. But right then, I didn't care. Let them wonder. Let them ask her why she was stranded at an airport with no money, no way home, no one to turn to. Eventually, after another cup of coffee, I turned my phone on. As expected, the notifications flooded in, missed calls, voicemails, messages from Mia, from mutual friends, even from a couple of her family members. I skimmed through them briefly. Her tone had shifted from confusion to panic, and now, anger. There was one message that stood out. "I can't believe you did this to me. After everything we've been through. This is low, Nolan." She still didn't get it. She still saw herself as the victim, the one who'd been wronged. The lack of accountability, the absolute nerve, it was almost laughable. I set the phone aside and decided I wouldn't respond to a single message from her. Not a call, not a text. She was dead to me. I'd made my peace with that the moment I saw those messages between her and Theo. Her betrayal had flipped a switch, and there was no going back. Around noon, I got a text from one of my close friends, someone I trusted. "Dude, Mia's trying to play the victim card with everyone. She's saying you ran off and cut her off financially for no reason. People are pissed. At her, not you. Everyone knows what she did. You're golden, man." I couldn't help but smile at that. I'd been worried about people judging me, maybe thinking I'd overreacted, but it seemed like the truth had a way of surfacing. I replied, "Thanks, man. I'll be out of town for a while. Just need some time to myself." He texted back right away. "You do you, man. You earned it. We're all here when you're ready." It felt good to know I had that support. That whatever story Mia tried to spin, people saw her for what she was. For once, I was the one with the control. I was the one steering my own life, without her lies weighing me down. I took a long walk on the beach that afternoon, letting my mind wander. I thought back on everything I'd been through, the years I'd spent building a life I thought was real, only to watch it shatter in an instant. But maybe this was what I needed, a clean break, a chance to start fresh, to rebuild on my own terms. By the time I got back to the house, I felt ready. Ready to leave all of it behind, to let go of the bitterness, the hurt. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. I stayed away from social media, ignoring the notifications that kept piling up. But curiosity got the better of me one afternoon, and I logged in just to see if anyone else had spoken up about Mia's little situation. Sure enough, there it was. A post from her, carefully worded, dripping with false sincerity. She wrote about feeling betrayed and left in the dust, by someone she thought she knew, about how people weren't what they seemed. She didn't name me, but she didn't have to. The comments below were a mix. Some people, mostly her friends, poured on the sympathy, saying things like, "Oh Mia, I can't believe someone would do this to you." But my friends? They knew the truth. A few of them even dropped hints, subtle comments she probably hoped would go unnoticed. One of my friends wrote, "Guess karma comes around when you least expect it, huh?" Another chimed in, "Maybe honesty would have saved you from all this, Mia." She didn't respond to those. Instead, she posted another carefully crafted message about people not understanding her situation, like she was somehow the victim in all this. I couldn't help but laugh. It was exactly what I expected, her attempt to twist things around, to play innocent, to make herself look like the wronged party. And yet, all I felt was a strange, detached amusement. She was scrambling, trying to cover her tracks, but the truth was already out there, and she couldn't undo it. That night, I got a message from a mutual friend, someone who'd been closer to Mia but had clearly heard enough to see things for what they were. He told me that Mia was trying to spin a new story, saying I'd overreacted, that nothing serious had happened with Theo, that it was just harmless flirting. She was desperate to save face, to find some way to make it sound less damning than it was. I took a deep breath, realizing that this was her final act, her last-ditch effort to rewrite the truth. But I wasn't having it. I replied to my friend, "She can say what she wants. I've got nothing to prove." And that was it. I decided right then to stop checking, stop caring, and let her bury herself in her own lies. It was strange how quickly things changed once I finally let her go. That sense of loss and betrayal was still there, but it didn't sting the same way. Instead, it felt more like a scar, a reminder of something painful but healed. Every day I spent away from the chaos Mia left behind was another day I felt stronger, more in control. I found myself looking forward to each day, not for what I'd left behind but for what might come next. I'd wake up early, pack a small bag with snacks and a water bottle, and drive down the coast to explore a new stretch of beach or find a new trail to hike. There was a quietness to those mornings that felt like therapy, a way to get back in touch with who I was before Mia had overshadowed everything. I took time to notice things I'd stopped paying attention to: birds hovering over the waves, the way the sun caught on the water's surface, the sound of the wind rushing through the grass. It all felt like reminders of a life I could reclaim, one that didn't revolve around someone else's lies. One afternoon, I was sitting on the sand with my sketchbook, drawing a rough outline of the beach scene in front of me. I hadn't picked up a pencil in years, not outside of work, at least. But there was something freeing about letting my hand move without any pressure or deadlines, just for the sake of creating something for myself. I realized how much I'd let my own interests fade away, sacrificed bit by bit over the years. Mia had once been everything to me, and I'd been so willing to mold myself around her life, her needs. Now, it was time to remember who I was, just as me. As the days went by, I found myself reconnecting with old friends, people I'd barely had time for while I'd been wrapped up in Mia's world. I called up an old buddy from college, someone I hadn't talked to in years but had always been close to. We met up for lunch one afternoon, and within minutes, it was like no time had passed. We laughed, shared stories, and I even told him a bit about what had happened, though I kept it brief. He didn't press, didn't try to make me explain. He just listened, nodded, and then cracked a joke that brought me back to the carefree days of our friendship. It was a simple lunch, but it felt like a lifeline. For the first time, I felt like I had a support system, real people who cared about me, who weren't wrapped up in Mia's drama or lies. That night, back at the beach house, I made a quiet toast to myself, raising a glass to new beginnings. The bitterness was still there, sure, but it was fading, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Maybe acceptance, maybe peace. It was one of those peaceful, golden evenings by the shore, with the waves gently lapping up on the sand as the sun dipped lower. I'd been walking the length of the beach, letting my thoughts drift, the quiet solitude becoming a comfortable routine. And that's when I noticed her, sitting alone on a worn beach towel, her arms resting on her knees as she looked out over the water. There was something about her that caught my attention, maybe the calmness in her expression or the way she sat with a kind of quiet, pensive focus. Her dark hair was loose, catching in the breeze, and a book lay open beside her, as if she'd been reading but had gotten lost in thought. As I passed, our eyes met for just a second. I nodded politely, and she gave a small smile, one of those quiet acknowledgments between strangers. But as I kept walking, I heard her voice, soft, almost hesitant, mentioning how beautiful the evening was, how she'd been finding peace in these beach sunsets. The way she spoke caught me off guard, as if she, too, was just looking for a little escape, a bit of solitude. I turned back, my curiosity piqued, and stepped closer. We exchanged only a few words at first, but they felt natural, comfortable, as if we weren't two strangers but two people who understood something unspoken. She told me her name, Sarah, and hinted that she'd been through her own share of heartbreak. It was clear, without her saying much, that she was here for the same reasons I was, a quiet place to heal. Sitting down beside her, we found ourselves talking, not about the details of the past but about those broader, more universal parts of healing that don't need much explaining. She mentioned the way solitude could bring a strange sort of clarity, and how losing trust in someone changed the way you saw everything. Without needing to share specifics, we both understood each other's losses. It was refreshing to talk to someone who wasn't interested in the details, only the experience of moving forward, of finding peace. As the conversation flowed, I noticed that the tension I'd been carrying felt lighter, replaced by a sense of calm. Her company felt strangely healing, a reminder that others, too, could be trusted, that life wasn't only defined by betrayal. By the time we wrapped up our conversation, the sun was slipping beneath the horizon. As she stood to leave, she gave a small wave, a gesture of quiet recognition, and walked off down the beach. Watching her disappear into the fading light, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet, stirring hope. Meeting someone else who had faced a similar betrayal, someone who seemed to be finding her own strength, felt like a small, unspoken promise that healing was possible, that life moved forward. As the evening turned to night, I sat there alone on the beach, feeling the first hint of anticipation for the future, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone in this journey after all. The next few days settled back into a familiar rhythm. Mornings spent walking the shoreline, afternoons exploring the town or sketching, evenings watching the waves. But something felt different now. The quiet didn't feel quite as heavy. There was something about meeting Sarah that left me feeling lighter, like her presence had filled a small gap I didn't realize was there. Occasionally, I'd scan the beach, half expecting to see her there on her usual towel with her book, gazing out over the water like she was searching for something just beyond the horizon. It became a habit, that quiet scan of the shoreline as I walked. But each time, she wasn't there, and I'd continue with my day, convincing myself it was better that way. After all, I hadn't come here to meet anyone new, let alone someone else recovering from betrayal. And yet, her absence left me feeling a bit restless, as if I was missing something I hadn't expected to want. One afternoon, while browsing a small bookstore in town, I caught a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye. She was across the room, flipping through a book, completely unaware of my presence. For a moment, I hesitated, feeling a strange mixture of relief and nerves. She looked just as she had on the beach. Calm, focused, with a quiet intensity. I could have just slipped out, left her to her own space, but something kept me there. We ended up bumping into each other near the counter, each of us caught off guard. There was that same small smile, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Without speaking much, We ended up side by side, browsing titles and quietly recommending books to each other, sharing a few thoughts on authors and stories we loved. She didn't pry, and neither did I, but there was an understanding between us that didn't need words. It was easy, almost comforting. As I left the bookstore, I felt something unexpected, an urge to know her better. We'd shared nothing personal, no real details about the scars we were carrying, yet there was an unmistakable connection. She was like a reminder that healing wasn't a solitary journey, that sometimes, just knowing someone else understood could make the path forward a little easier. That evening, as I sat alone on the beach, I thought back to Sarah. Her presence, brief as it had been, stirred something in me. It wasn't love, not yet, and maybe it never would be. But it was something, hope, perhaps, or simply the comfort of knowing someone else was on a similar road, searching for peace in the same quiet places. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I let myself believe, just a little, that maybe she and I would cross paths again. Then one evening, just as the sun was starting to set, I saw her. She was sitting further down the beach, wrapped in a light sweater, her gaze locked on the horizon. This time, she looked deep in thought, almost lost, her expression carrying a weight that reminded me of my own reflection back when I first arrived here. It was a look I recognized, a quiet heaviness that only comes when you're wrestling with the past. I felt a pull to walk over to say something, but I hesitated, unsure if she'd want the company. Then, as if sensing she wasn't alone, she looked up and saw me. Her expression softened, and she gave a small nod, an invitation, almost like she'd been expecting me. I walked over, settling down beside her in the sand, both of us quietly facing the ocean as the light began to fade. There was a stillness between us that didn't need filling. After a moment, she broke the silence, speaking in a low voice about the peace she'd found here, about the layers of herself she was starting to rediscover. She didn't go into details, but her words hinted at a similar journey of hurt and healing. She mentioned how her own trust had been shattered, how she'd come here not knowing what she was looking for, just hoping the distance would dull the pain. As she spoke, I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't with anyone since leaving. I shared fragments of my own story, how I'd felt lost and blindsided, like everything I'd built had crumbled around me. I told her about the betrayal, about how I'd come here to put space between myself and the life I thought I knew. Our stories weren't identical, but the heart of them was the same, a search for closure, for a sense of self after everything had been taken apart. Neither of us lingered on specifics, but it was enough to feel understood, to feel a sense of companionship in the silence. We sat there as the colors in the sky deepened, a quiet understanding passing between us. She didn't offer advice, didn't try to tell me things would get better. She just listened, and in that small, simple act, I found a comfort I hadn't expected to find. As the sun dipped fully beneath the horizon, Sarah turned to me, her gaze steady, almost resolute. There was a kind of unspoken promise in her expression, a reassurance that she, too, was here to rebuild, to find something real. It wasn't romance, at least not yet, but it was something strong, something real. We said our goodbyes without needing to plan the next time. It was as if we both understood that we'd find each other again, that there was no rush. Walking back along the darkening beach, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me, a rare feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if the broken pieces were beginning to align, each small encounter with Sarah helping me put my own life back into focus. The days felt lighter after that evening with Sarah, like I was finally pulling free from the weight of everything I'd left behind. There was a new rhythm to life here, one that wasn't defined by loss, but by the quiet discovery of what was left. Each morning, I'd walk the beach, sometimes alone, sometimes hoping to catch a glimpse of her. We didn't set plans or expectations, but every so often, we'd cross paths, an unspoken understanding pulling us together. One afternoon, I found her sitting on the shore with her sketchbook open, her pencil moving in slow, thoughtful strokes. She didn't seem to notice me at first, lost in her work, and I took a moment to observe from a distance. There was something familiar about her focus, the quiet patience with which she moved. It was like she was capturing something that only she could see. I almost turned back, not wanting to interrupt, but then she glanced up and caught my eye. She gave a small, knowing smile, motioning for me to join her. As I sat beside her, I caught a glimpse of her sketch, a half-finished drawing of the coastline, with waves rolling onto the sand and a solitary figure standing by the water. It was simple, yet somehow it held a depth, a solitude that felt personal. I realized then that it was a reflection of her journey, of her own path through everything she'd faced. We didn't speak much, but the silence was comfortable. At one point, she handed me the sketchbook, as if inviting me to add something, to leave my own mark. I hadn't drawn anything outside of blueprints in years, but I picked up the pencil and, with slow, careful strokes, added a small lighthouse in the distance, its light shining faintly over the waves. It was a simple addition, but it felt right, like we were quietly building something together, even if it was just a sketch on a page. Afterward, we walked along the shore, our conversation flowing in small fragments. She told me about the life she'd left behind, the pieces she was still piecing together, and I found myself opening up about the parts of my own story I hadn't yet shared. We spoke in general terms, keeping some details to ourselves, but there was a depth to the conversation that didn't require specifics. It was enough to know that each of us was healing in our own way, that we were both here not to be saved but to rebuild. By the time the sun started to dip, we found ourselves sitting on a driftwood log, watching as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. She leaned back, gazing out at the water with a soft, reflective look in her eyes. It was a look I'd seen in the mirror not too long ago, a quiet acceptance, a peace that had been hard-won. There was no need to talk about what might come next. It was as though we both knew that this connection, this quiet companionship, was enough for now. As the sun slipped below the horizon, we shared a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the path each of us was on, and how, for a moment, those paths had crossed. Walking back along the shore that night, I felt a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet, steady sense of hope that maybe, somehow, we were both finding our way back to something whole. Over the next few weeks, seeing Sarah became a regular part of my days, though never something planned or predictable. She had her own rhythm, showing up in unexpected places, a corner of the beach, a cafe by the pier, or once, outside a little art gallery in town. Every encounter felt unhurried, like a natural pause in our lives that we'd simply drifted into. One chilly evening, I spotted her sitting on the beach, a light sweater wrapped around her shoulders as she watched the waves. I joined her quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever thoughts she was lost in. She didn't look up but shifted slightly, making space for me as if she'd known I'd be there. We sat in silence for a while, each of us absorbed in the soft roar of the ocean, the sky darkening as stars began to appear. She finally broke the silence, her voice soft, reflective. She spoke about trust, about how fragile it felt, how hard it was to rebuild. She didn't mention specifics, but I knew she was talking about what had brought her here, the betrayal, the loss, the questions left unanswered. And somehow, her words stirred something in me. For the first time, I found myself opening up about Mia. I hadn't talked about her with anyone here, hadn't wanted to let those old wounds back in. But sitting there with Sarah, it felt safe, like I could finally let go of the bitterness and just talk about what it had been like. The shock, the disbelief, the hollow feeling that had haunted me for months. I kept my voice steady, focusing on the horizon as I told her about the moment I'd seen that message from Theo, the way everything had changed in an instant. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, almost protective, like she was holding the weight of the story with me. When I finally fell silent, she placed a gentle hand on my arm, just a small, simple gesture, but one that meant more than words. There was no pity in her eyes, just understanding. She didn't try to tell me it would be okay or that I'd find someone better. Instead, she just shared a quiet moment of recognition, as if to say, I've been there too. In that simple, silent moment, I felt some of the hurt start to ease, like a knot loosening after being wound too tight. As the night went on, we talked more about everything but our pasts, books we'd loved, places we wanted to visit, the small things that made us feel alive. There was no urgency, no expectation. It felt more like a quiet unfolding, a steady companionship that needed no promises. When we finally stood to leave, there was a calm between us, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever was growing here was something real, something steady. We walked back along the shore, our steps in sync, each of us lost in thought but feeling perhaps just a little more whole. That night, as I sat alone on my porch, I felt the edges of my past soften, like Sarah's presence had given me permission to let go, to look forward rather than back. It was the first time I felt ready to believe in the future again, to allow myself the possibility of something new. And for the first time since Mia, that thought didn't fill me with doubt but with a steady, quiet sense of hope. The winter air grew colder, the beach quieter, and yet our connection deepened in those moments of unhurried companionship. We had become steady fixtures in each other's lives, though neither of us labeled it or set any expectations. It was an understanding that needed no words, a companionship rooted in something deeper than attraction alone, something built on shared strength and a cautious kind of hope. One evening, as we sat on the porch of the beach house watching the waves under the moonlight, there was a different kind of silence between us. She looked over at me, a question in her eyes, something soft and vulnerable I hadn't seen before. I felt the familiar mix of gratitude and uncertainty, but this time, the uncertainty faded, replaced by a quiet, undeniable trust. Sarah spoke first, her voice steady but soft. She talked about how she'd come here to find closure, to shed the weight of her past and rediscover who she was. And now, she admitted, she felt ready to start something new. Not as a replacement for what was lost but as something entirely her own. There was a pause, as if she was giving me the chance to step away, to leave things as they were if that was what I needed. But looking at her, I knew I didn't want that. I took her hand, feeling its warmth and the quiet reassurance of her touch. I told her what I hadn't yet admitted to myself, that these months spent healing alone, these moments shared in her company, had shifted something in me too. I had come here to find a new beginning, and without even realizing it, I had found it in her. In that quiet space, we let the silence speak for us, letting the weight of the past finally fade. We were no longer the people defined by our betrayals or our losses. Here, together, we had become something new. Two people unburdened, ready to step forward without fear. The next day, Sarah left a small, handwritten note on my porch. Meet me on the beach at sunset. And when I walked down the familiar shore that evening, she was there waiting, her eyes bright with something I hadn't seen in either of us for a long time. A sense of peace, a steady, unguarded happiness. We stood there, side by side, our footprints mingling in the sand as the sun dipped below the horizon. This, I realized, was the life I'd been looking for. Not a life free of scars or shadows, but one that embraced them, that turned them into something beautiful. With Sarah, I knew I was ready to move forward, not alone but with someone who understood, who had been through her own storms and come out stronger. And as the last light of day disappeared, I felt a quiet, certain warmth settle within me. The past was behind us, and whatever came next, we'd face it together. One day, one step, and one quiet moment at a time.